So I will start off by introducing myself, but I'll probably just have you guys introduce yourselves too, because there's only three of you. So I'm Mendy Minjarez. I am an assistant professor in psychiatry at University of Washington. And I am on staff at the Autism Center here at Children's. And that is sometimes a confusing distinction for people because each University of Washington and Children's both have autism centers, but I work for the Seattle Children's Autism Center. I'm a licensed psychologist and I have background in applied behavior analysis. And so I run our applied behavior analysis early intervention program, which is what I'm going to tell you guys some about today. But I'm also going to spend a fair amount of time talking about the kinds of intervention strategies that we use. So, I kind of want to give a general overview of the program itself, so you kind of have the context, that I work in, but I'm going to spend quite a bit of time on actual strategies and sort of ways to think about making intervention naturalistic. So let's dive right in. So I have sort of four areas I want to go over. I always try to cover too much, but I do always also make it through my slides. So you guys can tell me if I'm going too fast at any point. And please feel free to ask questions because it's not like there's 100 of you here. So what I want to start out by doing is talking about sort of a new direction that the field of early intervention in ABA is going in, which is an idea that has been coined naturalistic developmental behavioral intervention. And I'm going to talk a little bit about what that is and sort of how it has come to, it's sort of a buzzword right now, so how it's come to be a thing that people are kind of talking about at this point in time. Then we'll talk about what our program here at Children's looks like and what components it has and sort of what role it plays in the community, because we are considered sort of a model demonstration for statewide implementation of services. And then I'm going to talk some about more kind of specific. So for those of you who are clinicians, especially the latter half is going to be of greatest interest. So I'm going to talk a lot about how we embed teaching trials in the natural environment in our program and how we fit that into kind of the daily routine of a classroom-based program, and also some specific strategies and kind of examples. So to really sort of bring it down to, examples of ways that you can actually use some of these strategies. So I want to introduce you guys to this because I find it to be a really valuable construct. Besides that, you'll be really cutting edge if you walk around saying NDBI. You're going to be super cool, but you're going to be so cool that people aren't going to know what you're talking about. So that's how cutting edge you're going to be. If you're at a research conference, they will, but if you're out in the community, they probably won't yet, right? Because you guys are going to help disseminate. But I really think this is a great framework for thinking about early intervention. So it's not just like, hey, we want to be on the cusp of what's, up and coming, but it's, I think this is great practice. So I think it's really relevant for the direction that early intervention and ABA specifically is going in. So a couple years ago, this paper came out. I include the citation like this because it's really well worth looking up if this is work that you're interested in. And Laura Schreibman, who is a, historically long-term career in, I should say, the field of applied behavior analysis, took the lead on this paper because there really has been sort of a movement in the field around trying to take applied behavior analysis intervention and make it more developmentally appropriate for young kids. So if you guys know the history of ABA, you know that 25 years ago, what it primarily consisted of, in early intervention at least, was therapists sitting one-to-one at tables with kids, doing rapid repetition, kind of drill-based intervention. It was very adult-led, it was not child-led, so not always highly motivating for kids, and just not developmentally appropriate for very young kids especially. So, when you have a 2-year-old and they're, like when I was in college, this is in the mid-90s, I used to work with this 2-year-old at his house, and he would be like falling asleep in the therapy chair, and the mom would run across the room and prop him up as I would be like shoving a goldfish in his mouth, because that's how we did ABA back then. But he was 2. Like, come on, this guy's been in treatment already today for 5 hours, and I'm like the 3rd person to come into these people's house for the day. He's on hour 6. He needs a nap. He's 2. And he's been in a chair. He's bored. He needs to get up and wiggle around. He's a little guy. So a lot has changed since then. And this is really an attempt at kind of trying to outline what are really the key parameters of these kinds of interventions, and how can we kind of capture what ABA looks like these days and how we can make it more naturalistic and developmentally appropriate. So I think this is a lovely article. It outlines, it's not a study, this is not an intervention study or an empirical article, but it outlines features of interventions that we could call NDBI, and I'll tell you more about what that means. So really all it means, it's very simple when you boil it down, is that we take applied behavior analysis teaching procedures, which we know are really effective. We have lots of research to support that in the autism field. And we combine them with developmental interventions and developmental theory. And we basically use developmental interventions and developmental theory to inform our ABA treatment. So what we have then is really robust teaching, really, very empirically supported teaching in the ABA, but embedded in context that we know is developmentally sound from a theoretical perspective. I think I'm getting mic competition going here. So, essentially you can think of it as when you have ABA plus developmental interventions and developmental theory, you get NDBI. And I'm going to tell you a lot more about what that looks like. So one of the things that this, sort of terminology and this thinking has also attempted to do is move us away from all of these different brands, if you will, of treatment. Raise your hand if you've heard of every single one of these. Has anyone heard of every single one of these treatments? And therein lies the problem, right? We have a speech pathologist in the room, we have a teacher in the room, we have a grad student in the room. Not a single person has heard of every one of these, and that is the problem. How about how many people have heard of one of those? Okay, everybody. And how many people have heard of none of them? Okay, nobody. So everybody falls kind of somewhere in the middle, right? And the main point of all this is there's a huge amount of overlap between all these different brands of treatment. Essentially what this slide represents is that these treatments have a ton of overlap, they have a ton of common features, but if you're the Kegels or Laura Schreibman, you've called it PRT for the last 20 years. If you are Sally Rogers and Jerry Dawson, you've called it Early Start Denver model for the last 20 years. But when you start to read about the components of these treatments, you find actually they have a huge amount of overlap and they rely on a lot of the same active ingredients. So the premise of naturalistic developmental behavioral interventions is to kind of say, like, what we need is good teaching in a natural context, and who really cares what you call it? Not to totally throw the baby out with the bathwater, though, there are some really good materials written about these models. And so these are 3 models that have some great materials published that are really, really useful clinically. So it's not to say like ESDM needs to get over it and stop, branding their treatment. They can do that, and what we need to be able to acknowledge is that has the features of naturalistic developmental behavioral intervention, and hey, here's a great manual that, as clinicians we could be relying on for certain things. So these are the 3 treatments that have published manuals. The others that were on the previous slide have empirical support. They've been around a long time and they're well studied, but these are the ones that have published readily available manuals, which is why I put them in. So if if this is treatment that you're interested in, these would be good reading materials. So to kind of bring it then to the treatment program at Seattle Children's, you might have gathered that we do what I would call naturalistic developmental behavioral intervention. And what we do is we really pull from a variety of models and use a variety of strategies because we have a lot of behavior analytic expertise on our team. A little background on this model for those of you who might not be familiar with this. Historically, kids with ASD have not received ABA in Washington State. If you've been in Washington State very long, you're probably aware of this. I know you are aware of this because you moved to California with a family. Is that right, or you met the family in California?
Yeah.
You met them there?
They were in California for the program.
Right, they left Washington to get services in California, is my point. So yeah, that was a perfect example. We had a family that had a lot of influence on our program early on. They had left Seattle and moved to LA to receive services. Now, families shouldn't have to do that, right? That's why that guy up there with the megaphone is saying, I want my ABA. And he's standing on a state, and I don't know what state it is, but it serves the purpose well for Washington State too. So what happened was in 2012, the Washington State Healthcare Authority got sued. It was a class action lawsuit related to the fact that insurance companies in Washington, and in this case it was Medicaid, were not paying for ABA, which was considered medically necessary for the treatment of autism. And so how our program came to be is that the healthcare authority came to Children's and kind of said, okay, Children's is our, our sort of local and regional pediatric healthcare set of experts. We need you to help us figure out how to roll out services for kids with autism in our state. That was a huge task, right? And so besides consulting with the HCA in general about how to develop their benefit and roll out those services, one of the things that we did was start this center-based model that I'm going to tell you guys about. Because one of the things that they knew would happen is that they wouldn't be able to provide adequate access to care, that the provider network in Washington was not going to be adequate because there hadn't been any funding for ABA. So if nobody's going to pay for it, there's not going to be a lot of providers in town, right? Because there's no funding source. So they knew they were going to have a problem, and they wanted to have a center-based model that was going to be comprehensive, and I'll tell you what I mean by that, but also short-term, which is very paradoxical, and we'll talk about that in a minute too. And so what we've now been doing over time is supporting the state and supporting the community in developing more and more of these models in different agencies and locations around the state by providing training and technical assistance to other agencies that want to start a program like this. So this has now been replicated about 15 times, I think, around Washington State, and thank goodness not all in King County, which is awesome. And I have like a monthly conference call with all the agencies that are doing it, and I'm available for consultation to agencies that want to start it. So the state has really been putting a lot of support around starting programs like this, which has been awesome. It's vastly different than things were 5 years ago, which is great. I told everybody in Washington, if you build it, they will come. And they didn't believe me, but now they're starting to believe me. Because I practiced in California before this, and there was tons of ABA in California. So now we have two ABA models in Washington. One is kind of the traditional ABA model that you might be familiar with if you know of kind of how ABA is usually practiced. It's typically in home. It can be center-based. It's usually long-term. And this is usually provided by community-based agencies. So the ABA day treatment program is specifically early intervention, and this is center-based ABA only, and this is what I'm going to tell you about. So these programs live in hospitals. There's one at Providence and Everett. That's another hospital-based one. Some of them live in birth to 3 programs, and many of them live in private agencies. And like I said, there are some around the state. We have at least one in each corner of the state, which is really nice. They just started one in Vancouver, Washington, which is awesome. And a few others kind of scattered around, Yakima, Wenatchee, and so on. Kashmir, which I didn't even know where that was until now, but now I do. So the idea is that this is a flexible enough model that it can be implemented in a range of different types of settings. So the parameters for the program are kids up to age 5 years, 11 months. We don't have a lower age limit. It's basically as soon as you get diagnosed, we'll take you. And we love the babies. Like we've had some 15 to 17-month-olds, and we just like love them. I love them when they're that young. They're so fun. And they make so much progress. It's awesome. Kids have to have a diagnosis of ASD and orders for ABA therapy services. So basically this is a statement from a physician or from a psychologist that ABA is considered medically necessary. So the only exception to the ASD diagnosis requirement is if somebody is willing to write orders for ABA under a different diagnosis, then insurance cannot deny it. So for example, a child who we think is at risk for autism because they're delayed and has a sibling with autism who, a provider feels would benefit from ABA, if a provider writes orders, insurance actually can't deny that. So that's an important thing for providers to know, that if you're a provider, you can actually access these services without a diagnosis of ASD, but you have to have orders and you have to be able to justify why it's medically necessary. Like in rare cases, the healthcare authority has even asked like for a research article that would, back you up or something like that. You have to be on Medicaid in this particular case. And then we say you have to be reasonably expected to benefit from the milieu and from the treatment program. So there can't be anything that's going to be a major barrier in implementation of your treatment. For example, we had a child, we were actually going to see this child, but another agency had said they couldn't see him. We had a child that we evaluated who was deaf and lived in a deaf family, and also had a diagnosis of autism. Jim Mancini, this was one of your patients. And they had been told by an ABA agency that I actually think they were willing to see him, but they were not willing to program communication goals for him because they figured that since he was deaf, they didn't need to work on communication anyway, which made zero sense at all, right? Like, there's an SLP over here who's like, what? So they kind of said, like, more or less, we don't think you're reasonably expected to benefit from the milieu. Now, in that case, we thought it was ridiculous. So, but if there was any major barrier, you know, that would prevent a child from really accessing treatment, that would be the only you know, situation where they might not access this benefit. It's never happened in our program. So the components of the program, the first component is just really thorough assessment. And one of the great things about having kids in a program that's a large number of hours per week, we have the kids 12 hours per week, is assessment doesn't stop after the intake. We have a really nice chance to thoroughly assess them throughout their time with us. So we don't stop at the beginning. We'll do standardized testing throughout if we think it's, you know, going to be helpful. We'll do functional behavioral assessment throughout. We're doing all kinds of measures during their participation. Treatment, obviously, which I'll tell you more about. We have a very significant family support component, which I'll tell you more about. And the philosophy there is because the program is short-term, and the goal of it being short-term, or the reason that it's short-term, is because the idea is that if there is not an adequate provider network, and if kids are going to sit on waiting lists for a long time, then at the very least they can get kind of an initial dose of treatment, and also the parents can have access to intensive parent training. And then while they're waiting for longer term services, the parents will have gained skills and will be able to support the child until they're in longer term ABA. So the family support component is heavy. We do research in the program, particularly looking at our outcomes. We do a lot of training, so that is a big focus for us at least. So we have BCBA practicum students, we have Masters in counseling, Ph.D. in clinical psychology, Ph.D. in school psychology. Those are regular students who are in our program on a weekly basis. We also have a lot of visitors, child psychiatry fellows. Today we had pediatric residents from Kenya. That was super cool. But stuff like that happens all the time, actually. So it's a really ripe training environment. And then replication is a huge goal, which I've already kind of talked about. That part of the goal is to be a model and to replicate that around the state. So just to give you an idea of the structure of the program, so I'm the program director. I'm a licensed psychologist. Not all programs have a psychologist leading them. Some have a BCBA, but there has to be a fairly senior clinician kind of overseeing the whole thing. There does always have to be a BCBA, so there's always a lead behavior analysis therapist. There has to be a speech pathologist. That's a requirement of the program. There's a family advocate, which is essentially like a case manager, and I'll talk more about her role, but she provides a lot of family support. Our program has what we call a behavioral educator, and what that is a teacher who has teaching experience, but who also has training in ABA. And so her job is not only to provide, behavior analytic interventions, but to oversee the milieu because it's a classroom. So you can't run a classroom if there's no activities planned for circle time or for group time or for, free play time. So having a teacher helps us to have the activities and the classroom format as the vehicle for working with kids. And then we have 3 certified behavior technicians, so that's a Washington State credential, or in sort of ABA terminology, it would be a registered behavior technician, an RBT. But those are essentially TA, like teaching assistant level folks who implement the intervention in the classroom. And the ratio in the classroom is 1-to-1, adults to kids. So we have a CBT for every child who is in the program. So like I said, it's short-term, it's center-based. The goal is to increase access, decrease waiting times, just get kids a dose of treatment. And it's meant to be comprehensive, meaning that they're receiving ABA services, but they're also receiving embedded speech therapy services and intensive parent training. And, we essentially run it like a preschool schedule. Like if you walked in, you'd be like, this is a preschool. Actually, we got a new director of the psychiatry department, and she came over and she was like, why do we have a preschool? And I'm like, this is not preschool. This is center-based applied behavior analysis intervention. But it looks like a preschool if you walk in the door, and you have to know what you're looking for. If you're a behavior analyst, you would walk in and be like, that was a teaching trial. So was that. But you have to understand what components you're looking for. So everything's really embedded. You will not see us like pulling a kid and doing, discrete trial or kind of more drill-based intervention. So our process, looks like this. First, kids come for an intake assessment, and then the treatment itself is 4 days a week, 3 hours a day for 12 weeks. So insurance will authorize 48 treatment days over 12 weeks. The speech therapy has to be a minimum of once a week. That's the insurance requirement. Our speech therapist is in the room 2 full days a week. Parent education has to be a minimum of once a week. I'll tell you what we do for parent ed. And then we have to provide some kind of discharge or transition support, which we actually provide for all 12 weeks, not just for 3 sessions at the end. But those are kind of the minimum requirements for insurance. So if a program, like if you're a provider in the community and you refer a kid that you're working with to a program like this and they're billing insurance, this is what they should be getting at a minimum. And if they're not, they're in violation of their insurance contract. And that's helpful, I think, for providers to know for just like quality assurance. Like if you were working with a family, you could say, oh, you're not getting speech? You're supposed to be getting speech. We should find out why. So the focus is really kind of circumscribed. Short-term ABA is a catch-22. It's paradoxical. Like treatment of autism is not short-term. Autism isn't a cold, right? Like treatment of autism is a long-term endeavor. And so because we only have a short period of time, we kind of get circumscribed with our goals because we want to be focused on things that are going to make a difference. So, we look at the big picture when we do an intake with a child and we say, what is going to make a meaningful and functional difference in this child's life that we can accomplish in 12 weeks? So my favorite example of that is potty training. Like if we can potty train you while you're here, that makes a huge difference in your life, and your parents will love us forever, because that makes such a big difference for them too. If we can teach you a communication system, if you come in and you don't know how to point, we've seen some kids who come in and their communication is so impaired they don't even reach for objects. They don't know that if they reach for something, another person will see that as communication and will give it to them. So if we can teach you to point, or if you're going to, not develop words during those 12 weeks, to use a picture exchange system, and even if it's just a few pictures, like an all done picture, a snack picture, and a toy picture, that makes a huge difference, right? Kids who have no communication system at all have very disruptive behavior because that's very frustrating. So we really try to hone in on what are like 5 or 6 things that are going to make a huge difference in quality of life. And how can we develop goals that we know we can do in 12 weeks to make that difference? So these are, the kinds of things that we typically program for. Learning readiness, adaptive skills, language and communication. You won't really see us doing things like, teaching a child how to hold a pencil. They can learn that now, they can learn that later. It's probably going to take longer than 12 weeks. And functionally right now, at this point in time, it doesn't make a huge difference in your quality of life. So, that kind of thing we feel like is outside of our scope. Or complex cognitive goals, or academic readiness, working on letters and numbers and sight reading. These are things that definitely take longer than 12 weeks and don't translate to functional skills until much later. And so we really want to get functional skills developed within the time that we have the kids. So the kinds of interventions that we use, like I said, you might have guessed, are what I would call NDBI. We really err on the side of being naturalistic. We use interventions like pivotal response training. We do use some discrete trial teaching, which is not necessarily naturalistic by definition, but we embed it in the natural context. So if a child is not learning well, then we might use some trials that are a little bit more drill-like, but we're going to do like 3 of those while sitting on the floor playing with toys and then do other stuff. We're not going to spend an hour at the table drilling something like you might have seen 15 years ago in discrete trial teaching. We do a lot of functional behavioral assessment because part of our goal is to reduce challenging behaviors. do a lot of functional communication training. So these are just examples of like sort of broad categories of interventions that we use. Embedding the SLP services is something that we oftentimes get asked about. And, you know, Jim and I actually gave a whole talk on this at the Washington State Speech and Hearing Conference last fall. So this in and of itself could be like, that was like a 2-hour talk. But ABA therapists kind of traditionally work on their own. There's not a lot of settings where ABA therapists come together with speech pathologists, but the benefits of doing so are huge. So the way I kind of think about this is we've got the teaching methodology that we want to use and that we know has empirical support. That's ABA. That's the teaching methodology. But that doesn't mean that we know everything about speech and language development. We're ABA therapists. We know quite a bit about child development. But when it comes down to some specifics, you know, our knowledge of speech and language can be broad strokes. So if we're talking about specific articulation difficulties or specific grammatical challenges or some social pragmatic skill that isn't quite clicking and we're not putting our finger on it, the expertise of the SLP is hugely helpful. So we have that person assess the kids initially with us, and then of course along the way, they provide regular consultation to our staff. Like they're in the room, she's in the room 2 days a week, you know, for the full duration of the session, and she goes around and sits with every staff and every kid during instructional time and, you know, provides consultation on a really sort of hands-on, you know, regular basis. She does do some direct work with the patients, but typically that would be on less on like functional communication goals and more on something specific and kind of targeted, like an articulation, you know, issue, for example. We have the SLP embedding group activities, so like run circle time or run group time and then prompt the kids and work on their communication goals. And we have her participate in parent education and training when it's necessary. So it's really, really helpful to have that component, you know, kind of pulled in. And what we don't do, sometimes people ask us this, what we do not do is have her come and just pull out a kid and go work with them for 20 minutes and then bring them back and go get the next kid, because it's too fragmented. So we really treat it like a team approach. If she's gonna work with a kid, that's great. She's gonna sit down with them and their TA during instructional time and work with the child while the TA watches and assists. And it's gonna be all embedded into the classroom routine. It's not gonna be fragmented like that. And that's super important to us and to me about our model. Like I want our model to be very cohesive and comprehensive and with everything really embedded. The family support piece is really significant as well. So we do a lot of direct teaching with parents. We teach them how to do functional behavioral assessment to reduce challenging behaviors. We teach them how to do communication trials or teach skills to their child. And then we provide a lot of broader family support. So the case management piece, the discharge planning, you know, we've had you for 3 months and we've learned all these great things about how to support you in a classroom. We should probably be telling your teacher those things. We just gathered a lot of data that might be helpful. So all that coordination and communication is part of that role. But the other thing that our family advocate does a lot of is much broader family support. Housing, financial stressors, legal problems. And the premise is sort of like, you know, if you're struggling with housing, your ability to follow through on the behavior plan that we just wrote with you is probably going to be fairly compromised, because when you go home at night, you are worried about like much bigger issues. And so we really try to have a, you know, a systemic kind of a focus so that we can peel back some of those broader issues so families can get down to supporting the child. So these are our parent education components. I'm not going to go into too much detail just in the interest of time, but I run a parent ed group, which is every week for 90 minutes. Some of it's didactic, some of it's discussions. We watch a lot of videos from the classroom and we like narrate the teaching trials. Or the part they hate is we make them videotape themselves in the classroom and then we narrate their teaching trials. But I love it because they learn it. You know, they're all self-conscious, but actually they do great. And so then we get these videos and we start looking at it, and it's amazing. Like, it's really good evidence that they are learning how to, you know, work with their kids. We then also, so the parent education group is kind of set content. I have a pre-prepared set of sessions that I do with every family. Individual parent ed is really parent generated. So like, hey, what are you struggling with at home? toilet training, feeding, sleeping routines, you know, behavioral challenges, going out in public. I can't take my kid to the grocery store. So all that stuff is individual parent ed. We have them go into the classroom, and then the assigned therapy assistants do that parent ed, so that the parents will join the instructional time, watch the TA work with the child, switch roles and receive coaching from the TA on how to work with the child, and so on. The family advocate meetings, which I've mentioned, and then we have an adapted plan for non-English speaking families. So people will often ask us if we have the capacity to take non-English speaking families, and I'll tell you what, if we didn't take them, we'd lose like half of our caseload. We serve a ton of non-English speaking families. And these actually are the families that I like to see the very most receiving treatment from us, because they have such a hard time accessing services due to language and cultural barriers. And so when we have them in our care for 12 hours a week, we have such an opportunity to provide them with information, to help them make phone calls, to help them advocate, all these things. And it makes a really significant difference when they can receive that amount of support from us. So because it's hard for them to participate in group with an interpreter, we adapt the whole plan so that they can receive that content, but one-on-one with interpreters. So that kind of gives you an idea of just the components of our program. What I want to go into now is a little bit more of the nuts and bolts. So how do we actually embed these teaching trials in the natural environment? And what I'm going to do actually is I'm going to take us through our daily schedule, and I'm just going to talk about each kind of component of the day and how we might embed trials during those types of activities. We have to pay a little bit of tribute to Eileen Schwartz, our hero from UW, who has done lots of work in this area. And this is a really nice article. For those of you who are educators or students or like to look up literature, this is a really, really nice article that came out that talks about, it's not specific to autism per se, it talks about just characteristics of a high quality early childhood learning environment. And you know, a lot of it you're kind of like, oh yeah, that's good. But when you start thinking about autism, you go, oh yeah, these things like having, you know, responsive and predictable environment, having many opportunities for learning, meaning that we're getting lots of teaching trials, having engaging interactions. Like we need to be extra engaging with kids with autism, right? So when you think about it in this kind of a context, these principles become really salient. So I think this is a really nice article for thinking about how can you maximize the richness that you can bring to an environment for kids. So our daily schedule, if you saw this and it didn't say Seattle Children's on it, you might be like, yeah, that's every preschool in the United States. What did I tell you? It's just like a preschool, right? But why is it like a preschool? Because that's what's developmentally appropriate for this age of kid. We need a context to work in. We need an environment that's natural for them. And so we set it up like a preschool, but it's not a preschool in the sense that we don't have a preschool curriculum. We don't follow any kind of educational curriculum. What we do is we go through a routine like this and then embed all the teaching of the skills that the kids need to work on all throughout those activities. So communication skills, play skills, social interaction skills, and so on. So that's what I'm going to kind of walk you guys through now. So the other thing that I'll say about kind of doing embedded teaching, so for anybody in the audience who is a behavior analyst or in training in special ed or behavior analysis, one of the things that behavior analysts always say is like, yeah, but naturalistic intervention is so hard to implement because you can't take data. It's so messy. And especially like the really well-trained ones who really love their data and really rely on it, they get super cranky super fast when they can't take data easily. So we do not use electronic data collection. We're very unsophisticated, but partially that's because this data sheet has to be able to follow the staff around the room and not be a distraction for the kids. So if we're like sitting in, the blocks area of the classroom and we've got an iPad that we're taking data on, what do you think every kid who comes into that area is going to do? They are not going to want to play blocks. They are going to want to play with the iPad that you have. So we're old school with our data, and we don't try to take data on every single thing we ever do. What we do try to take data on is 10 trials, so that's why these are in blocks of 10 trials of every goal that a child has every day. with the exception of communication trials, which is the frequency count over on the far side, which we aim for like 30 to 50 in a day. And so when you really add that up, we have the kids for 3 hours. And so let's say they have, 6 goals. So that's going to be 60 trials plus at least 30 more communication trials is going to be 90 trials. We have them for 3 hours, like right there, they're getting like a trial every couple minutes, at the minimum. So already it's a lot to just fill up the data sheet. But once 10 trials have been documented, then we don't have the staff continue documenting. So it's like collect enough data to represent the day, but you don't have to document every single thing you do. If a trial is sitting in front of you and you know it's going to be a great one, but the data sheet's over there, well, don't not do it because you can't take the data. Do it and then make sure you document the next one so that we're at least documenting our 10 trials for the day. So it is messy and it does get, hard to implement sometimes, but it is totally doable from a behavior analytic perspective. And every single day we take data on every single goal and we document it in the medical record. So we are accomplishing, our mission here of having our data to represent the treatment that we're providing. So to kind of go through the schedule, so if we talk about, embedding teaching trials at arrival, and a lot of times these are times of day where people kind of think, oh, it's a transitional time. Like that's not a teaching opportunity. Well, the second they walk in the door, what do you have an opportunity for? A greeting. Hello, hi, I'm here. Or responding to a greeting. We break that down into 2 goals. So right off the bat, then once you go wash your hands, which we make you do, and that could also be an adaptive goal, task analysis for hand washing, which we make every single kid in the program do. Then how do you join play? Well, that's a skill. Boom, we've just targeted 3 goals. Initiating a greeting, 4 goals. Initiating a greeting, responding to a greeting, task analysis for hand washing, and initiating appropriate play. And you haven't even been here for 5 minutes. So done, right? And when you start to really sort of break it down like that, you start to realize, okay, with the right adult support and the right, kind of framework in place for, hey, you walk in the door and therapy begins, we can crack out all kinds of teaching in 3 hours. Guided free play is one of my favorites because it's a great generalization time. It's exactly what it sounds like. It's just free play, just like you would see in a regular, preschool classroom. We have areas throughout the classroom, kind of a blocks and trains and toy area, tabletop activities like puzzles or art, a book area, a dramatic play area with play kitchen and little costumes and whatnot, which is in front of a one-way mirrored window. So then the kids will all put on their costumes and I'm a fireman, pose in front of the mirror. So that's always entertaining. So again, this is another time where it's really easy to just be like, they're playing. Okay, we're just going to let them play. No, this is rich, right? This is rich with opportunities for teaching trials. So under communication alone, I have, and these are just examples. This isn't exhaustive. Requesting objects, requesting for help, giving an object to someone for help, gaining attention. What if a child doesn't know how to gain adult attention? They need to learn how to tap or say teacher or call people by name. Self-advocacy, no, move, that's mine, get out of my way. Those are skills that kids have to learn. Appropriate protesting, I don't want that, no thank you. Following directions, put it in, clean it up, put it on the shelf, all these kinds of things. So right there, again, we've got how many goals that we can target just in the communication domain. Social, things like sharing, turn taking, initiating. When kids start to get more sophisticated, reciprocal thematic play, let's play with the baby dolls in the doctor kit, and you're the mommy and I'm the doctor, and we're going to play this out for 2 minutes, right? These are things that kids with autism need tons of scaffolding for. Even playing structured games, like how do we play a board game and take turns, or how do we play Don't Break the Ice, or Hi-Ho Cheerio, some really simple preschool games. I mean, the board game companies are benefiting from the things that we are buying, because we are Hi-Ho Cheerio, Don't Break the Ice, Zingo, the number of silly faces, but they're really appropriate, simple games for preschoolers, right? Play, just functionally how to play with objects. What happens to a kid with autism when they walk into a preschool class and they don't know what to do with the materials? Here they are, and they're well, there's Mr. Potato Head, and there's blocks, and there's a piggy bank with toy coins, and there's a hippo that eats shapes, and there's a shape sorter, but I don't know what any of those things are for because I'm a child with autism and I haven't learned that by watching my peers or figuring it out myself. So what am I probably going to do? It's probably not going to be functional or appropriate, right? So we basically, we'll take, even at the most basic level, when kids are not verbal enough to really learn more complex play, we're going to take 10 different toys and teach them how to play with them. If you know that if you take that toy hippo that eats the shapes off the shelf and put the shapes in it, that you're going to be doing the appropriate thing, well, you are participating in so much more functional of a manner than if you just go in the room and wander around. So a lot of functional play. Then moving up to pretend play and more sustained play and interactive and thematic play. Participation in tabletop activities like art, all kinds of things that we, again, can be embedding during this time. And then we might have more kind of structured interventions during this time, like following a choice board. Today, when the doctors from Kenya were there, I was narrating what was happening, and one of our kids who's quite impaired, who's 5, so he's going to be going into kindergarten. He doesn't know how to do the school routine or follow directions, or he was sitting at the table and doing adult-directed activities. So he had a board, and he had 3 tokens on it, and if he did 3 things, he was going to get access to his preferred activity. And underneath that was the choices of adult-directed activities he could do, but it was like the ring stacker or the pegboard or the, different kind of close-ended activities. And they were astounded when he chose the ring stacker, she sat it in front of him, she said, "Do the ring stacker," and she walked away. And he starts, guess what, doing the ring stacker because we've taught him how to do it. And when he's done, he takes the star and he puts it on his chart. And this is like just during free play. That was a toy that was available at the table during free play, totally appropriate. So that kind of thing can really be taught very effectively when the teaching is really embedded. So lots and lots that can happen, right? Circle time. So circle time is one that I love watching because I've done a lot of work in the schools, and so often it's so hard for kids with autism to participate in circle time, and schools and classroom teachers don't have the resources to teach them. One teacher can't teach 8 kids in a special ed class how to sit at circle. That teacher needs help doing that. And because we have one-to-one, we can teach these kids how to sit at circle. And sometimes when I look out of my office, because I have a window into the classroom, I'm like amazed when I look at these kids and I go, no way would these kids be participating, and they're sitting there like, icky, sticky, sticky, sticky bubble gum, and they're like doing the hand motions, and I'm just like, it astounds me. But again, it's the one-to-one teaching and all the support, and then if we can generalize that to the natural environment, it's really, really effective. So even during circle, we embed individual goals. So, what song do you want to hear today? Might be a requesting, question that we could ask a child. Greeting each other, calling each other by name, following directions, stand up, give me your dot, go to the table, circle time's over. Sharing, like, we're going to do a song with a puppet and now your turn's over and you have to pass it to the next friend. Self-regulation is a big one for circle because when kids don't like sitting at circle, they have to be able to learn how to tolerate it. So teaching kids to tolerate delayed reinforcement, like first circle, then reinforcement. Teaching kids how to ask for a break because even that is better than having a tantrum at circle. So again, tons of goals that get embedded during these times. Snack. I think snack is one where it's a little bit more intuitive to think about like how we might work on things like requesting. Typically how we set up snack is there's a snack leader and that person gets everyone's snack, all the kids' snacks in a bin, and then they give little bits at a time so kids have to work on things like requesting or gaining attention. If we know a child has a gaining attention goal, like the snack leader might turn away when that child's plate is empty, and then they have to wait for the child to call them by name, something like that. Saying you're all done when you're done. Again, that's better than chucking your snack bowl across the room. So we'll, a lot of times we'll allow kids to just sit at snack for a few minutes. And if they can sit for 2 minutes, eat something, say all done appropriately, and then go, that's a really successful routine. And we can build the duration of time that they can participate, and we can build what they can do over time but we're going to set them up for success that way. And then we oftentimes actually also facilitate social interaction. So like sharing or, talking, kids who are more verbal will facilitate like beginning conversation. Like, what we have these snap talk cards that we use, and it'll be a conversation starter with visual cues. Like, what's your favorite, recess game? And it will have like, whatever, going on the slide, going on the swing. And so the visual cue kind of helps them start to have beginning conversation, for example. Instructional time is where kids get really more intensive instruction on their goals. So this is a time where kids are paired up with their TA and they go to a specific area and they really work intensively on their goals. And we program 5 areas of the classroom where each TA and child can go together with highly motivating and preferred, activities and toys for that child. So each staff will stock a shelf in an area for their child. So that when they break out into individual instructional time, the preferred materials for that given child are in the area. So it's very child-led, it's play-based, it's typically on the floor, although sometimes goals, are better to implement at a table. So sometimes we use little tables and cube chairs. But it's up to the child oftentimes. Oftentimes we don't make them sit at a table. And we're embedding it all within child-selected activities. So if the child goes to their shelf and they pick moon sand, well, we're going to figure out how to target your goals using moon sand for the next 5 minutes until you pick something else. And if the next thing you pick is instruments, then we're going to target your goals using instruments. We oftentimes will also do specific things with materials. Like, for example, we will have bins that have 2 sets of everything. So instruments is a really common one. So we'll have 2 drums, 2 maracas, 2 tambourines, 2 triangles, and then we can work on things like imitation. So then if the child picks up the drum and starts banging, the clinician can pick up the drum and start banging, but then introduce a novel action like, oh, here, shake the maraca. And it's a really natural way to work on imitation with kids, for example. So we'll stock the areas with materials in a very specific manner in order to have what we need to teach the skills that the child is working on, but also have it be motivating and engaging for the child. During recess for us is in a gross motor room because I just cannot convince the hospital that we need a playground outside. I tried a lot of different strategies and just hasn't been successful yet. At one point they were like, the fire marshal won't allow what you're trying to do. And I'm like, darn, all right, back to the drawing board. But we have a gross motor room, so that's pretty good. And, so we have a swing and we bring in mats and it looks like an OT room, essentially. So these are great social opportunities. Recess is not a break for these guys. Requesting activities, taking turns, lining up for the swing. Like, that's a playground skill, right? If someone else is on the swing, you can't jump in and kick them off. Appropriate physical boundaries. And because these are gross motor activities, there's a lot of shared enjoyment. So a lot of tickle routines and then stop and have the child make eye contact or verbally request or gesture toward you and then continue the routine, for example. A lot of joint attention type skills get fostered within those types of routines. Again, tolerating a delay, waiting for access to activities. We have a sandbox in there that is a big, tolerating a delay exercise. It's like a sandbox on wheels, sensory table type thing. But only 2 kids, there's only space for 2 kids at it. And so, of course, everybody always wants it. That and the swing are 2 really good, waiting trial opportunities. So lots of great stuff happening in there. This is probably our sort of messiest, if you will, teaching environment because it's hard to have instructional control when kids are running around and engaging in gross motor play. So the teaching in this, type of a setting is, I would say, the most naturalistic. You got to just catch it when the opportunity arises, but it's harder to sort of contrive it in these types of situations. But there's tons of situations where you can catch it when it arises. They're waiting for the swing, this child is done, prompt them to ask for a turn, So you could just send them on to the swing, but if you stop in that moment and prompt them, they can practice asking for a turn. So all that adult scaffolding that can happen so that kids can practice skills. Group time, I would say, is kind of similar to snack time. So we do tabletop activities. It's usually art, Play-Doh, that kind of stuff. But there's a much broader range of materials. So during group time, we don't just give everybody all the materials and let them have free access. We do things like put paper at each kid's seat and maybe put one marker or one color of dot art. And the rest is with the person who's leading the activity. And you colored in your apple with the red marker you had. Now you need a different color marker. So what are you going to have to do? You're going to have to ask a friend. You're going to have to ask the leader. If the leader's not paying attention again, you're going to have to say their name. Again, all these kinds of things that can be embedded. And this one I really like because there's such a broad range of materials. Like Play-Doh, we have 15 different Play-Doh tools. So I want the roller, I want the cutter, I want the scissors, I want the cookie cutter. They can label the shape of the cookie cutter, so on and so forth. So one of the things that we do that I think is really useful, this is why I love teachers. Like, I'm a psychologist, I'm not a teacher. I knew there had to be a way to do this, but when I hired teachers, they were like, oh yeah, here. They like have an activity matrix in their back pocket practically. You know this, you're a teacher. And I was like, it's brilliant, and they're like, no, it's standard. But we use this kind of thing all the time because we have 5 kids in our classroom, and if you're the one running group, you can't just be targeting your kids' goals. You have to know what every kid is working on, so you need that information at your fingertips. And so every morning we review it, but we also have tools like this posted in the classroom. So this might be posted in the snack area, for example, to remind everybody what that what each child is working on during snack. A different version of that might be something like this. So this would be for an individual child. So for example, this could be like something that a clinician has on their clipboard, and they sort of make notes for themselves, like which of this child's goals could I target during arrival and free play? Which ones should I be targeting during circle? And this is especially a useful tool if someone has to sub in, because you can just hand them, besides just saying like, here's a list of the goals, like here are some ready-made ideas about how you can target these things throughout the day. So these kinds of tools make it a lot easier to do that embedded instruction rather than sort of being prepared for a therapy type interaction. We can just be delivering the instruction all the time. So now we're going to go one level deeper, and what I'm going to talk about, and we'll probably talk about this for like 15, 20 minutes, and then we'll have some time for questions. What I'm going to talk about is kind of specific strategies that we use for embedding teaching trials. And what this is essentially is a while back, I was like, okay, there's all these ways that people embed behavioral teaching trials into interactions with kids. They call them all different things, and nobody sort of has written them up in any one place. Nobody has said like, okay, here's all the ways, that we can gain control over the reinforcement and set up a trial and then be able to deliver the reinforcement to the child. So I did an exhaustive review of all the interventions that we would call naturalistic developmental behavioral interventions, and I pulled out every strategy that relates to how to set up a naturalistic trial, and I made a list and a table, and that's what this is. And I'm going to publish it, but you guys get to see it first. So in ABA, and especially in naturalistic ABA, those of you who are familiar with ABA will be familiar with the idea of shared control. Those of you who are not, what we mean by shared control in ABA is ABA is based on the premise that if we can prompt a behavior and reinforce it when it happens, that we can create learning, right? That's the premise of behaviorally based early intervention. So if I want to teach you how to point, I might literally have to take your hand and form your finger into a point. And when I do that, if someone reinforces you by giving you what you want, you're going to figure out after however many trials, oh, yeah, when I do this, you give me what I want. And so we always are setting up situations in such a way that we can reinforce the target behavior, because that's the premise of the teaching, is that reinforcement results in learning. And so in order to do that, we have to have what we call shared control over the reinforcement. If you already have it, if you have this water already and I'm like, point to your water, and you're a kid with autism, you're gonna be like, no, why would I point to my water? I already have it. It's not functional in the interaction, right? But if I have it and you want it and someone is prompting you to do something and then you're gonna get it, you're going to be a lot more motivated and interested in doing that. And it's going to start to make it click for you. Oh, I see what I have to do to get what I want. So shared control becomes the premise for everything when we're trying to set up naturalistic trials, because you have to have some control over the materials in the environment if you're going to use them as a reinforcer. If the child already has them, then they already have the reinforcer and you can't use it that way. So essentially what this section is like 10 shared control strategies and or ways to contrive these teaching interactions. So in a simple example, and most of these are communication examples just to illustrate the point, but in a simple example, all it is holding an object, for example, out of reach until a child communicates. So if it's a nonverbal child, maybe it's pointing, maybe it's pecs, maybe it's the use of a device. If it's a verbal child, it's going to be asking. If it's a very verbal child, it might be more complex, speech or more complex ways of asking. So, like I said, nonverbal, it might just literally be something like pecs. A child who's an early language learner, it might be a single word. Like you hold up the cow with the barnyard toy and the child says cow. You give the cow. So that's a teaching trial. You held up a reinforcer, they engage in a target behavior, you reinforced it. Maybe in a more complex example, there's a couple different sets of toys and the child says, like, hey, let's play the barnyard. Really natural, right? And reinforcing it with the barnyard is the really natural thing to do, but it still has the components of that teaching trial. So these...
How is that shared control? That sounds like total control.
It's shared control because the child has chosen the activity. So the premise of shared control is that you're doing it with activities that the child has selected, so that it's child driven in that sense. They're selecting the teaching materials, but you're maintaining control over the thing that they're motivated for until they engage in a behavior to access it.
So the child chose the ring stacker.
Exactly. Yep. And if the child didn't choose the ring stacker, then we would say, don't do a teaching trial because you don't have a reinforcer. If they haven't chosen it, you don't have a reinforcer. So then you're just forcing them to do something. Like it might work, but you're not using ABA teaching methodology if you do it that way. And oftentimes it won't work because they're not motivated. So, and it's especially an important distinction because historically in ABA, we didn't necessarily let kids choose the activities or the materials. We would do things like flashcards. You can teach colors with flashcards. What color? Good, it's red. What color? Good, it's blue. But we could also be like, oh, you want to play blocks? Okay, what color? Oh, right, it's a red block. Here you go, let's stack it. And if you want the blocks, then the blocks are going to function as a reinforcer, so we can embed those teaching trials and do lots of them. Yeah, thank you for asking, because that's a good question. It's considered shared because it's child-led. So sometimes we, in a situation, we might not be embedding trials because we might be waiting to see what the child is motivated for. So we're not going to just, say to a child like, come over here and do this, unless they have a goal that's adult-directed activities, but then they're going to have a whole framework around it. But what we're more likely to do is watch and see what they do, see where they go or what they pick. Oh, you're picking this, the moon sand. Okay, let's get that out. But I'm not going to take the lid off for you because I want you to have to practice asking for help right now, for example. So they chose the moon sand, but now I'm going to do a help trial by leaving it with the lid on and making you ask for it, in order to access it. So that's what these kind of strategies are all geared around, is how to set it up in such a way that they sort of need to communicate with you in order to get access to what they want, whatever the goal might be: asking for help, requesting objects, gaining your attention, asking a question, all kinds of things. So another strategy is environmental arrangements, which is a strategy that comes out of incidental teaching. So for parents, we call it insight out of reach because it doesn't sound nearly as jargony as environmental arrangements. So just putting things where kids can see them but can't get them, right? So if you put toys in bins, if you store things on a high shelf, so like the first example, store the snack on the high shelf, and if the child points, I want those cookies, get it down. That's a teaching trial. You had control over the cookies. They did a behavior. You reinforced it by giving them the cookies. Phones and tablets. Oh my gosh, like the number of interventions that we do around where the phone and the tablet gets kept at home. But put it out of reach at the very least, because if they're going to access it, which they are, make them work for it, right? So then they have to ask every time they want it. Or, you know, and for more verbal kids, like make it more complex, you know, not just like, I want the remote, but like, what are we going to watch? Or, you know, how do we use the remote? I don't know. Which buttons should I push? There's tons of questions you could ask about it, right? To get kids to, you know, to, again, practice their skills. Environmental arrangements can also be within an activity. So this one I really love for parents who do like table activities with their kids, or who sit down and do games or puzzles, or, you know, kind of activities where they're staying in one place for a few minutes. So again, rather than like getting everything out and just giving access, you can kind of engineer the environment a little bit. So sitting down at a table, giving, you know, 1 or 2 markers and keeping the rest is an environmental arrangement within an activity. And parents are great at this kind of stuff because they, you know, the materials in their environment, like if they're going to get out the art materials, they're typically also kind of involved with that, for example, with their kids, because most parents don't give free access to markers to their 3-year-olds. So there's just, you know, there's a lot of good stuff that can happen here. Even things like, you know, building a train track. Like, what's the first thing a kid does when they take out a box of trains or blocks? Dump it, right? Over it goes. Shared control, out the window. But if you can say, okay, hey, let's build a train track. I'm going to help you get started. Here's 5 pieces and, you know, 1 train car. I've got the rest, you know. Now you have to ask. Do you want trains or tracks? Do you want how many? Should we count them? What color is it? Where does it go? Are we going to, you know, should we make a bridge or a tunnel? Like, again, all the things you can talk about while you're doing that kind of thing. So these are, you know, some other examples that are kind of more classroom specific. Like I gave you guys the group examples, placing all the Play-Doh stuff out of reach and so on. Playful interruption or obstruction is one that I love. It takes a little creativity because kids get mad when you interrupt them, right? Especially kids with autism, but really all kids. So the key is for it to be playful, for it not to just be like, oh, I'm going to block your train track, because no kid finds that to be super fun, right? But if you're like, oh no, there's a dump truck backing up onto your train track. What do we do now? And you stay there, well, now you have shared control. So now you can sit there until they tell you, get off my track, dump truck, or whatever they're going to say. And the reinforcement is, get off their train track and keep going about the play. So there's all kinds of silly things that you can do to interrupt kids in play. And once you've interrupted, then you maintain that shared control until they communicate with you. One that I love is this nonverbal one example. So in the Early Start Denver model and in some other models, people refer to this kind of thing as sensory social routines. So where you set up some kind of a, you know, sensory or sort of motor-based routine, like a tickle game or spinning the child around or picking them up and down, this kind of stuff. And then once you've done it a few times and they sort of see, oh, okay, this is the game we're playing. You pick me up, you swing me around, you put me down. Then you can start pausing in the middle of the routine and waiting for them to make some kind of a social, you know, initiation or engage in a social behavior. So, you know, you can wait for eye contact. You can wait for even just a vocalization, like, like something that looks intentional, even if it's not a word. You could wait for a gesture, like reaching to be picked up, for example. And all of those kinds of behaviors are really appropriate behaviors to reinforce. And even when kids have more skills and can do a lot of other things, these tend to be such motivating routines for kids. Little kids love this kind of thing, right? So almost every kid in our program has a sensory social goal because we want the staff to remember to engage in routines like this because they're just highly engaging and motivating. And it reinforces the child's social engagement with you. So that one is a really nice kind of playful interruption type routine. I already gave sort of a train track example, you know, any kind of blocking, placing your hand over the car wash, you know, entrance, or like we have this garage toy that has keys, like locking the, you know, the garage with the keys and then being like, oh no, it's locked. What should we do? What do we need? Oh, here's the keys. I have the keys. You know, and have the child say like, it's time to wash the car. Open the garage. Come on, Teacher Mendy. So all kinds of things you can do there. turn taking and kind of balanced turns gives you an automatic opportunity for shared control. It's my turn. Well, guess what? When it's your turn, you have it now. So you have shared control. So a lot of times we will do this kind of thing with kids, even when we're not working on turn taking. We'll just kind of work on getting them to relinquish objects, and then they can quickly request it back. But we especially do it when we are working on turn taking, because it's a really nice opportunity for them to say something back to you like, now it's my turn. So, you know, all kinds of opportunities there. And there's natural ways to do this too. So it doesn't just have to be like I'm taking a turn with the thing. The middle example, we do all the time, and I'm constantly coaching our staff, like, don't forget to take those naturally occurring shared control opportunities. So when the toy cars get to the bottom of the ramp and the child hasn't picked them up yet, you can pick them up before the child does. Or the marble ramp, the same thing. Like when they get to the bottom and they're going around, you take them off. Now you have shared control automatically. So it's there's a lot of naturally occurring opportunities for shared control. Even like when the child, you're playing with some toys, let's say, and the child puts this thing down right here and focuses on that thing, well, snatch it back up and get shared control again so you have it for a later learning opportunity. So sort of maintaining good control over the materials and being opportunistic on when a child puts something down. Reducing adult anticipation is something I work on a lot with parents especially. Teachers and therapists are pretty good about this because they're in the habit of trying to foster independence. It's something they're used to. Parents are kind of the opposite. Parents are in the habit of meeting their child's needs because that's what a parent is supposed to do. And we're talking about little kids where it's really normal for parents to be meeting their needs. And especially in like, 1, 2, and young 3-year-olds, they're still sort of coming out of the, the baby stage where the parents had to meet all their needs. So we talk a lot with parents about like, yeah, that your child is, wants that snack, but don't just get it for them. Just pause in the moment and prompt them to request it. And boom, you've got a trial. You're walking up to the door and you're about to open it to go outside because they can't open it themselves. Well, stop. They can point, they can say, hey, let's go outside. All those things that you automatically do. You put your child in the car seat. You take your child out of the car seat. You put your child in the bathtub. You help them in and out of their high chair or their, dinner or breakfast chair. You put their jacket and their shoes on and off. You do all these things, and your help is what they need. You are the reinforcement in that scenario. But if they want it, they have to want it. It assumes that they want it. If they don't want to put their shoes on, then this example doesn't apply. But if they're motivated to complete that routine, then you can have them do things like say, help me with my green jacket, or have them follow directions. Go get your green jacket. So all these situations where parents and adults kind of automatically, do things for kids, we can stop in the moment, make them communicate, and then proceed with the routine or the assistance. Assistance is one where we purposefully set up something so that the child is going to need adult assistance. So it does include kind of reducing your anticipation of the child's needs, but you're being a little bit more, you're contriving a situation a little bit more. So for example, handing a child an unopened chip bag on purpose. So the staff love these because they're like, ooh, how am I going to get the child to ask for help today? Or we'll do things like put it in a screw top container, like here's your snack and wait, and then if they don't ask, like we'll prompt, of course, because we're not trying to be mean and like torture them, but those are opportunities where they're motivated, right? So another thing that we'll oftentimes do is like, kind of wait for while the child struggles a little bit with a toy. Not till they're too frustrated, like that's not the point. But watch them sort of try to construct something, for example. And when they need help, don't just jump right in and help. Kind of wait and see if they ask. If they don't, maybe prompt like, oh, if you need help, you could ask me, and see if you can get them to again, sort of naturally be asking for help in those situations. But we do all kinds of like snacks in screw top containers, snack, packaging that we don't open for kids, juice box it, like here's your juice box. Or we'll even do things that are a little bit more goofy, like here's your juice box and we still have the straw, you know, or like, here's your soup and I'm holding the spoon. So like, what do you know? And again, we're not trying to do it like it sounds a little sneaky and like, you know, maybe mean, but we're going to prompt them right away to do the right behavior to get what they want if they don't automatically do it on their own. And it's a great way for them to learn all these kind of self-advocacy and help asking skills. Interrupting routines is another one. So pausing in the middle of a known routine so the child will have to communicate. So, you know, again, doing things like standing by the door instead of just automatically walking through it. Or you're putting their shoes on and you like stop with one shoe in your hand, like, huh, what should we do next? And because those routines are really familiar, number one, they usually want to complete it because it's something that they're familiar with. But number two, they also usually know exactly what comes next because it's something you do every day. So, you know, like the last example, we're going to the park, we arrive, we don't unbuckle you from your seat. What do we need to do? Like, come on, let's go to the park, Mom. Natural reinforcement comes when we unbuckle you and take you to the park. Inadequate portions or breaking it up, I've sort of given a little bit of, alluded to a little bit, but it's this idea that when you have a toy that has a lot of pieces or an activity that has a lot of materials, you don't have to just give access to the whole thing. So it's the train example, like don't dump the whole box, give a few pieces, get them started, make them request for the rest. Or set up the art activity or you can do it with anything that has multiple pieces. Mr. Potato Head, give them the potato head, don't give them the pieces. Now they have to go through all the body parts and tell you what they are. So, you know, lots and lots of ways that we can break up those activities so that we can get more trials. So, you know, rather than just saying, I want trains, and now you're going to play trains for 20 minutes with no more trials, or having to think of other ways to get trials, we can get, you know, 5 or 6 trials out of just setting it up. Intentional ignoring we'll do when the adult has control of a preferred object and the child needs to, you know, engage in behaviors to appropriately gain attention. So we might do things like, oh, you're setting up your train track and I'm just going to slowly turn like this and act busy. Well, you know, like, oh, I'm looking for trains. Oh, this is cool. And I'm going to wait for you over here to say like, Teacher Mendy, I need more trains, and turn around. Or if you don't, then I'm going to prompt you, or I'm going to have another teacher prompt you to, you know, to say it to me. And then turn around, reinforce. So these are, again, we kind of contrive them so that kids can learn. And then when it naturally comes up, like let's say it's snack, the teacher's helping someone else, and they just aren't paying attention to you right now because that's what happens in a classroom. Well, now you've practiced that skill and you can be like, Teacher Blaine, pay attention to me, you know, like I need more snack. And that's the real true use of that skill, right? That's the generalization. So we want to be teaching those, and, you know, sometimes we have to contrive the teaching opportunity in order to then get to the generalized use of the skill. Sabotage, you know, sort of overlaps with what I said before about setting up like the help trials, for example. So providing parts of an activity while withholding obvious parts. So like actually the food and the spoon example fits here too. Or, you know, setting up the train tracks, but then like, where's the trains? Or giving the pieces, but not the board. Like, here's the Candyland cards. What else do we need? You know, we need the board. So lots of silly stuff we can do there. This is another sort of silly one. So setting up situations that we know are going to be a little bit challenging so that we can teach self-advocacy. So, you know, getting in a child's way on purpose. At a level we know they can tolerate because we're not trying to cause them to have a tantrum, but we're trying to have them just be frustrated enough that they're motivated to say, stop it, move, that's mine. And a lot of kids don't have skills for this stuff, right? And so they either get walked all over by their peers or they act disruptive. And so we explicitly teach, you know, kids to say things like, move, give it back, that's mine, no thank you, I don't want it. And even though it seems a little paradoxical to teach such things to 3-year-olds because we think of kids that age as being really good at this stuff, a lot of times kids with autism are not. And although it can go the other way where they then do it too much, these are skills that kids need to learn how to do. Silly situations, I think we're getting to the end of these here. Silly situations is kind of similar to sabotage, for example, where you just do goofy stuff to get kids to tell you that it's not right, you know, that you're doing it wrong. So, like a lot of these cause and effect toys have a power switch on the bottom. And so we'll like turn off the power switch and like, oh no, it's not working, and they have to engage in some kind of communication to get you to turn it back on. Or, like give the wrong person the wrong thing. Like, Daddy, here's your fork, and it's the baby fork or whatever. No, Mommy, that's not Daddy's fork. That's my fork. Or pretending to put, did the pants go here? No. Where do they go? They go on the legs, the child can say. So again, the shared control is like you have the object that they're ultimately going to want within a familiar routine. You make them tell you how to do it the right way, and then you do it the right way, which is typically reinforcing if they like the routine. Again, they have to like the routine. They have to want the outcome. So if they don't care if you gave Daddy the baby fork, it's not going to work. It has to be meaningful to them. So take-home messages, perfect timing, 10 minutes for questions. The thing I think is really important about naturalistic teaching is I think of it as like the least restrictive form of intervention, if you will. So like in the schools, we talk about least restrictive environment, meaning don't put the kid in an increasingly specialized or increasingly therapeutic setting if they can function in a less therapeutic setting. Put them in the setting with the least support where they can still do well, so it's sort of as typical, so to speak, as possible, moving them towards as minimal support as possible. So naturalistic intervention I sort of think of in that way. Putting kids into therapy that's sort of highly therapy-like and not play-based and not fun and is more restrictive. And the less we do that, the better chance kids have for learning functional skills, generalizing those skills, maintaining those skills outside of treatment, and so on. So besides the naturalistic treatment is the most developmentally appropriate treatment, it also really promotes generalization and maintenance of skills because you've taught the skill in the context where you're supposed to use it. You haven't taught it in a therapy session and then hoped for the best that the child would use it over here. If you just start by teaching it in the natural setting, you don't have to worry about that as much. And most skills can be taught this way. Now, not always. I mean, there's definitely kids who struggle to learn specific skills for specific reasons, and we have to get more structured or more adult-driven. But I would say, like, 80% of skills we teach in this way in our program. And it takes creativity, it takes playfulness, it takes tons of materials. You have to have massive amounts of toys to do this. But it's really, really effective when it's done well, and it's really, really developmentally, I think, makes the most sense to me. So, I think a big take-home message is ABA, high-quality ABA, can be delivered in a natural environment while still maintaining the fidelity and the data collection and all the characteristics that make it good ABA. That can be done. And what it takes is creativity. Like you have to get creative. Embedding teaching trials is fun. Like most of the examples I gave you were silly, they're goofy, but that's what's motivating about it for kids. And so, having therapy that is fun at face value, I think is really important. So now we have 8 minutes for questions, so I'm gonna stop. Do we have questions? Yeah.
So I'm thinking about the two broad areas of goals that you mentioned in the beginning about.
Oh, Jim's got a microphone for you. You can, yeah, as long as you're right there with it. Is it on?
I don't, oh, there it is. Okay.
There it is. That way our people who are at remote sites can hear you.
Okay. So I was thinking about the two broad areas of goals that you were talking about in the beginning, increasing functional skills, but then also decreasing disruptive skills.
Yeah.
But a lot of these teaching strategies seem focused on increasing skills. Would you use the same ones for decreasing disruptive skills?
Yeah, so it's a really good question. Yes, and then we also add other strategies in. So typically when we're decreasing challenging behaviors, so in ABA we have a whole framework for how we evaluate and treat challenging behaviors. Which is to do, careful analysis of what's triggering the behavior, what kinds of consequences might be maintaining it or, reinforcing it inadvertently. So we do all that analysis and try to figure out what we think the functions are and what kinds of things we might need to change in the environment. But a huge component of that is usually teaching replacement behaviors. So then we're going to say like, okay, you're doing it for attention. So the environmental changes that we might need to make are like, don't give you attention when you do it, for example, and do give you attention when you do other things. But if you never do anything that's appropriate for gaining attention, then we also have to teach it to you. And we're going to use these kind of strategies to teach it. Also, because when you're having a challenging behavior, that's not the teachable moment. Like, that's not when we start saying like, oh no, you need to tap Teacher Mendy. No, we got to teach you to tap someone's shoulder or say their name outside of that context during teaching and learning time. And then we are able to prompt it during the challenging behavior. So there's a lot of this gets used in a behavior plan, but also other strategies about things that we're going to change in the environment, which we just didn't get into tonight.
Yeah. Can I add something to that? Because I'm an SLP. I know you're an SLP. So, you know, when we think about what we're going to replace, we're going to think about functional communication.
Yes.
And that's
Yeah,
a
totally.
whole thing that, you know, we could always,
That's like
we
a
could
whole
spend a
talk in and
whole
of itself.
90 minutes
Like,
talking about
yep.
functional communication strategies. But as SLPs, what we often do is think about, oh, these kids got to talk more. I got to expand their language. And in the context of disruptive behavior, I think that as SLPs, we can really help promote some of this idea of like, well, how do we give them an easy button to push that is going to replace this behavior that is going to be as easy as this behavior and work better than the behavior that they're showing.
Yeah, totally. And one of the things that I love for SLPs to contribute in this kind of scenario is that like the SLP we have right now, she's so good at breaking down, like, appropriate protesting is a good example. We'll be like, well, the kid needs to learn how to say no and stop and all these things that are, and she'll be like, oh yeah, but there's like 5 other nonverbal protest, social pragmatic behaviors that we could teach, like we haven't even thought of. And, you know, and she's all going like the social pragmatic kind of, you know, SLP route. And we're just thinking like the obvious functional behaviors. So this is where like the marriage becomes awesome. Yeah.
He's pointing over to you. So I'll get the microphone to you next.
My question is, how do you teach your staff to deliver this training? So what is the training for the staff?
Yes, that is a very good question. So the staff, the CBTs, the Certified Behavior Technicians, the requirement for them is to have 40 hours of training in best practices of ABA. And there's certain things we have to hit, like assessment, reinforcement strategies, prompting strategies, consequence strategies, like it's all this ABA terminology. But they have to have 40 hours. And so we either have to give them the 40 hours and vouch that they had it, or there's like little training programs and things that they can do. And then we do a ton of like coaching.
So do they come to you? Like, do you hire people like teachers? I mean, what are the backgrounds? Like, what are they coming from? And
Yeah, no, it's they at that level. They don't have to have specific like educational background. So they don't have to have like a master's in teaching or we require them to have a bachelor's degree. And it's certainly helpful if it's in something like early childhood or psychology or something like that. But a lot of times people will go into this field without a bachelor's in a related field, and they'll go into it because they're interested in working with kids with autism. And so we'll be really kind of training them from the ground up, which is really common actually in ABA, because the TA level is sort of a paraprofessional level. And so the BCBA, who's overseeing the program, is required to make sure that the TAs that they're signing off on, because the billing and the delivery of the service goes under the BCBA's license. So that person is ultimately responsible for what the TAs are doing. And so if they are hiring people who are untrained, then they have to provide them with that 40 hours of training. Now we, because we're children's, like we tend to be, when we have a position open, we tend to get highly qualified applicants because people are motivated to work at children's. So we don't typically have to train our staff coming in, but we do not represent the community at all in that way.
But like in Eastern Washington or in other places?
Across the street, like up in the U district even, like immediately outside of a big organization like this, the community-based agencies, they're training people from the bottom up all the time. Yeah. And it's one of those levels or those type, it's sort of like early childhood, childcare providers, it's one of those sort of levels of, professional expertise where it's easy enough to train them. I mean, it's not that hard to give 40 hours of training, so you can take someone and train them from the bottom up, but oftentimes they move on. Like, there's a lot of turnover, so that's why people are always training. The good ones always go back to grad school, so yeah. But agencies would tell you that most agencies have like a training identified trainer, like a person who's in charge of that process, because they have to have enough staff. Yeah. Over here there was yeah.
Does TA stand for, I don't know?
Oh, when I
something
say
assistant?
TA, I mean teaching assistant.
Oh, teaching assistant.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
All
It's
right.
kind of a loose way of saying, yeah.
Our kids are older, 5th grade down to kindergarten, and tomorrow I'll be at a meeting where some staff will say these troublemakers have to pay the cost. They have to suffer the consequences. So what do I say
Boils
to
my
them?
blood.
Yeah, right. I'm boiling without an outlet, so
Yes.
help me.
I bet. So you're talking like in the public schools.
Correct.
Yes. You say to them, do these quote unquote troublemakers have IEPs, I'm assuming?
Yeah, they do.
Yes. Okay. So the first thing you say to them is, this child has an IEP and you are required to support the child's ability to participate in the regular education or in the public education environment.
Yeah, but the special ed teacher is leading the charge. That you got to. It's consequences.
So have they done a functional behavioral assessment?
Nope.
So that's the next thing they need to do. This is good information for everybody. This is a very relevant question. So they are required actually to do a functional behavioral assessment if the child is having behavioral challenges in school that are interfering with that child's ability to access the educational curriculum that is being provided and is considered appropriate for that child's needs. And if they're doing things like suspending or doing this kind of stuff, we have to have a meeting to talk about these bad kids, then that's the next step in intervention that they need to provide. And they're in violation of the special education rights if they don't conduct an FBA and develop a behavior plan to facilitate that child's participation in their free and appropriate education, which is their right. Now, that doesn't mean they're going to do it. So that doesn't mean that tomorrow when you walk in and say, you're supposed to do an FBA, and I know that because I'm a savvy parent, doesn't mean they're going to do it. So a lot of times you have to like really start getting your like backing as far as, triggering their ability to, or their willingness, I guess, to indulge that right, which is like the special education ombud's office or, going up the chain of command in the district or whatever you have to do. But particularly if kids are being disciplined or suspended, it's really inappropriate for them to not have done a functional behavioral assessment.
Okay, that's really useful for everybody out there. And I am on the Seattle PTSA for special education. I'm an IA, and I'm working with kids who are not troublemakers in tomorrow's situation. I'm thinking of a student who has lost recess and computer privileges because he didn't hand in his homework.
So you're an IA in this context, not a parent?
I am.
Oh, I was thinking you were a parent. Okay.
Sure, I look
Well,
like
you can
one.
still be a savvy IA at an IEP.
Hey, you're right. But so I need to dial it back from kicks, bites, and breaks windows to doesn't hand in homework and is disrespectful. I think those are his
Yeah,
crimes.
so again, how are we going to support him? Like,
So,
he doesn't
so
hand...
I can't say we need an FBA on this guy.
Well,
I need to
maybe.
say punishment doesn't work, and
Yeah.
I have proof.
Yeah, and
because-
how are we going to support? So, like, he doesn't hand in his homework. It's not because he's a jerk,
Yeah.
right? Like,
Well,
it's
no,
be-
they think he is.
Well, yeah, but I mean, I think it's fair to say, like, it's not. It's because he's lacking in skills. Like, what are the barriers to him engaging in this expected behavior, and what skills does he need to be taught, and how are we going to either teach those skills or put modifications in place? So modifications and accommodations, and like we do this kind of stuff all the time in our classroom even, like if you won't sit at circle, we're going to put a modification in place in our program to help you sit at circle. So if you can't turn in your homework, maybe we need to teach you organization skills, and or maybe we also need to say, This kid doesn't turn in his homework every single day. He can't remember. It's part of his skill deficit. He doesn't understand the routine, whatever it is. He needs a prompt. He needs a visual cue. He needs a special homework folder that's somehow different from everyone else's. He needs a sign on his desk that says, turn in your homework, buddy. You know, like there's tons of things you can do, most of which are not too complex. But if we haven't sort of addressed what's the skill deficit, then going to you lose recess because you didn't turn in your homework, number one, it's not going to work, but really it's also unfair. You know, like if you said to me, like, go climb Mount
Yes, yes.
Rainier or you can't have dinner for the next week, I'm going to say, that's not fair because I don't know how to mountain climb. You know, like I can't do it no matter how bad I want dinner. So what am I going to do then? I'm going to be mad and I'm going to not like you and I'm going to act out, right? That's like, hello, why do you think he's, you know, doing things that make it seem like he is a little jerk? It's because he's in a really crummy spot in a situation like that. He needs to be taught skills, or he or she, I should say. And, you know, and I know that stuff's hard to advocate for, but sometimes it's actually not that complicated. Like, how do we get the kid to turn in his homework can be a lot of simple modifications, you know. Some of the things I just said, reminders, visual cues, prompts, a special place for his homework, a sign on his cubby, a sign on his desk, you know, I don't know, maybe he puts the homework in the bottom of his cubby and the teacher knows like that's where she's got to collect it from. And if he can do as well as getting it out of his backpack and setting it there, then we say, you did awesome.
You could do modifications to the amount of homework he's going to do. You know, I mean, the question is like how hard is it for him to get this homework done? How much the parents, you know, working every night to get him to finish this? And, you know, some kids can do it. He could be spending 3 hours on his homework and he's still not getting it done due to executive functioning deficits or
so
whatever.
Until you assess it, like maybe he's not turning it in because he didn't do it. And then you find out like, oh, he doesn't turn it in because he's embarrassed or he's afraid because he didn't do it. Like there's so many layers, right? So that's like the assessment and the treatment becomes the question, not the discipline. And particularly for a kid with an IEP, you know, the question is how do we support?
Right, and how do we do it in a positive way as opposed to, you know, just punishment, you know? So how do we incentivize, hey, if you get your homework done, then you get something extra, as opposed to being like, well, you don't do your homework, then, you know, you're going to lose the only, you know, fun thing that you've got all day.
Totally. Or how do we teach kids a work ethic rather than a work outcome? So like, hey, your job is not to do 5 sheets. Your job is to do it and stay on task for 15 minutes. And even if you only get 3 math problems done, you stayed on task. You met your goal, you know? So how do we figure out like really what are we teaching here? Like what's the purpose of this, of having homework in the first place? My kids' elementary school did away with homework. They're like, you know what? Homework is a huge battle. Parents hate it. Kids get frustrated. Teachers have a heart attack trying to collect it every day. And the research doesn't really support that it's actually that effective.
That's right.
So our whole elementary school.
Nobody knows that. Say
Well,
that again.
you can tell them. You can tell them Whittier Elementary in the Seattle Public Schools, and we're not the only one, has a no homework policy that was recommended by the special education resource teacher. So there you go. There's another.
I do think you can get some ABA out of homework. So I just have to put a word in for that. So I do
There's
think you
yeah.
get good things out of it.
Completely. Yeah, absolutely. And some kids, like, they really need that. The flip side of it being, the flip side of it being negative is, like, some kids do great when they can take it home, do it later under no pressure, have time. Like, there's all kind, there's a flip side to everything, right? So that's what you're going to try to go in and advocate is what is this individual child's scenario and how do we figure out the benefit or not of this situation and what supports we need to make it successful?
I think positive discipline says the 4 R's of reaction to punishment are resentment and revenge and resistance and retreat. And that
Sounds right to me.
That
makes
sounds
sense.
right. Yep.
But I don't know how to detach a certain generation of American from that perspective.
Now you're asking me to solve a problem
Yes,
I can't solve.
that could be. That's what we're going to do next year's 200 lecture
Right, now
series,
we know
right?
what we can
We
talk.
got a
have
whole
whole
topic
talk
for
on
next year. So I think we're over time.
Yeah,
Thank you,
yep,
Mendy,
totally.
for
Yeah.
being here. I'm sure she'll chat with anybody who wants to.
I'm happy to,
hang out.
yeah.